Hello, everyone, and welcome to the TDWI webinar program. I'm Andrew Miller, and I'll be your moderator. For today's program, we're going to talk about the TDWI Agentic AI Readiness Benchmark. Are you ahead or falling behind? And our sponsors today are Precisely, Snowflake, and ZoomInfo. For our presentations today, we'll hear first from Fern Halper with TDWI. And after Fern speaks, we'll be joined by Ana Maria Badalescu with Precisely, Santiago Geraldo with Snowflake, and Derek Osgood with ZoomInfo for a panel discussion. Before I turn over the time to our speakers, please allow me to go over a few basics. Today's webinar will be about an hour long, and at the end of their presentations, our speakers will host a question and answer period. So if at any time during these presentations you'd like to submit a question, just use the Ask a Question area on your screen to type in your question. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can click on the Technical FAQs area and you'll receive technical assistance. And if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, you can locate the resource window to download the PDF. Lastly, we are recording today's event and we'll be emailing you a link to an archived version so you can view the presentation again later if you'd like. Again, today we're going to be discussing the TDWI Agentic AI Readiness Benchmark, and our first speaker is Fern Halper. She's Vice President and Senior Director of TDWI Research for Advanced Analytics. Fern is well known in the analytics community, having been published hundreds of times on data mining and information technology over the past 20 years. She's also the co-author of several books on cloud computing and big data, and the newly released Data Makes the World Go Round, The Data, Tech, and Trust Behind AI Success, which is now on the Amazon bestsellers list. Fern focuses on advanced analytics, including predictive analytics, machine learning, AI, cognitive computing, and big data analytics approaches. And she's been a partner at industry analyst firm Hurwitz & Associates and a lead data analyst for Bell Labs. She's taught at both Colgate University and Bentley University, and her PhD is from Texas A&M University. With that, please welcome Fern, and I will hand it over to you now.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar about agentic AI readiness. So agentic AI is obviously a top priority for many organizations, but the question is, are they ready? So this webinar is going to be based on the results of our recent agentic AI readiness assessment benchmark. If you haven't taken it yet, please do so. It's on our website. You can find it under Think. And what I'm going to do today is share some of the results of the assessment with you. And we'll also have, as Andrew mentioned, a panel session with our sponsor experts to hear their perspectives about agentic AI and readiness. So I'll tell you about the key dimensions of readiness that went into this assessment and what the results are to date. And in the panel, we'll talk about the gap between experimentation and production, as that's where many organizations are now. And we'll talk about architectural and organizational requirements for agentic AI, as well as some governance concerns around it. So let's get started. Okay, so I'll start with the headline, and the headline is Agentic AI is top of mind for many organizations, but they're still struggling to operationalize it, and maybe that doesn't come as a complete surprise to most of you out there. What we see in TDWI research and in this assessment is that organizations are actively exploring agentic AI, and many are viewing it as a way to become a transformational change, I would say. We'll look at the readiness assessment in a minute, but we've seen in TDWI research that 10% of participants may have multi-agent systems that are already in production. What's interesting is that I've seen in a number of more recent surveys that that number is claiming to be about 45%. And I think part of that has to do with some of the vagueness around what organizations are calling agents and single agents and multi-agents, and also what putting agents into production means. I think that organizations are definitely making progress, but we'll see how they're not necessarily there yet. And you can see some of the execution gaps that I'll talk more about as we get into this. So in some ways, organizations underestimate agentic readiness. Many have agentic experiments out there, but that's not the same as a production environment for it. And of course, there's a lot of different ways to implement agentic AI. You know, vendors do have agents already built, and that can certainly help jumpstart. Here, you know, I'm talking about putting it into sort of production in your environment. And across the results, we see a pattern, which is that organizations are building capabilities, but that progress is uneven and not yet integrated into an enterprise-ready foundation. In many cases, the organizations have parts of a system in place, but not the system itself. And a key issue, I should say, is that organizations often equate the ability to build or experiment with agents as readiness. And in practice, agents actually operate under very different conditions than traditional analytics or generative AI. They require continuous access to trusted data, contextualized data. You need to understand your processes. There needs to be clear constraints on their behavior. And without these elements, systems that appear effective in experiments and isolated scenarios may break down when you put them in the real world. And this contributes to this broader pattern where organizations may perceive themselves as further along than they are. And what we see is that AI adoption is a progression. So organizations are moving along this maturity curve, gaining experience with simpler systems and then advancing to more complex ones. So when we look at agentic AI readiness, we're really looking at 5 dimensions of that. I think of it as that agentic AI is not just a tool, it's sort of a capability that an organization should have. And you could see these 5 different readiness areas. We have organizational and capability readiness, data and context readiness, technology and engineering readiness, governance, risk and control readiness, and operational and learning readiness. So in terms of the organizational and capability readiness, this is really about looking at whether the organization has the people, the leadership alignment, the culture that's needed to support agentic AI. It's going to include factors such as sponsorship and strategic clarity and funding and the availability of skilled talent. So does the organization have the capabilities and alignment required to successfully adopt and manage agentic AI? Then there's data and context readiness. So here we're looking at whether the organization's data can effectively support agentic AI systems that reason and act with context. So it looks at things like data availability, quality, consistency, integration, support for structured and unstructured data, and then also the presence of semantic meaning and metadata to provide business context. With technology and engineering readiness, we're looking at the technical environment and the architecture that's capable of supporting agentic AI and whether the engineering talent is in place to do so. So that includes platforms and infrastructure, integration capabilities, support for orchestration and tools, scalability, and of course, the engineering resources that are required to build and maintain these systems. With governance, risk, and control readiness, we're looking at the organization's ability to manage the risks associated with agentic AI and ensure responsible use. So that's going to include frameworks and access controls and monitoring and observability and auditing and compliance and mechanisms to enforce guardrails. And then finally, with operationalization and learning readiness, we're going to look at the organization's ability to move agentic AI from experimentation into production and then continuously improve it over time. So that's going to look at deployment processes and workflow integration, the human AI interaction model, monitoring and feedback loops, the ability to scale, and all of that. So, we're thinking of this as sort of not a tool, as a set of capabilities, these 5 capabilities as part of a sort of a system that helps you build agentic AI readiness. And so the way that this works, and those of you who have filled this out have experienced this, is that each dimension has a potential score of 20 points. So there's 5 dimensions, 5 times 20 is 100. So when you take the assessment, you'll get a score out of 100. And the score is going to determine what stage you're at. And you could see those on this chart here. So for instance, a score less than 5 in an individual dimension means that the organization has not established the foundational technical governance or operational capabilities required for agentic AI, You could see at the other end that a score of 19 to 20 means that the organization is ready to operationalize agentic AI by extending existing practices and building on those. And most of the median scores are at the preparing stage, which we'll see, which means that the organization is actively defining and aligning the capabilities, roles, and controls that are needed for agentic AI. So this chart shows the overall readiness of the organizations that took the assessment. That was when it was reported here, I think it was in the 160s. So the median score, you can see overall, is 69 out of 100. So those of you with eagle eyes would have seen that on the first chart. And you could see that most are in the preparing stage across these 5 dimensions, although the 215s that you see there are right on the border of enabled, which is where the organization has established the core foundation. So I just want to spend a minute or two going through each of these 5 and giving you some highlights and lowlights. So in terms of data foundations, organizations, of course, have made progress with that. I mean, we're working on that, for quite a while. And you could see that, organizations from the organizational perspective are thinking about teams, but they have limited skills or processes. So, for example, we asked about, the teams, are there teams there in your organization with sustained responsibility for AI-enabled systems, not just the short-term projects. So organizations are thinking about the teams. You could see that about 35% on the bottom bar there have sustained teams that are formally accountable for the life cycle of AI-enabled systems, including operations and outcomes. So thinking some organizations have teams in place, but you could see, that they're working on this now. It's sort of a split. Likewise, but that's happening, as well as some of the funding, even experimentation, all the way up to production. But in terms of actual skills, that's an area for improvement. So that's how I'm going to talk about all of these as a strength and an area for improvement. So you could see that, 30% of the respondents are saying that skills are formally in place, and another 14% are saying skills are available in relevant teams. Those are the 2 bottom bars there. But, a lot of the skills are missing. Some, in many cases, organizations don't know the processes that they think that they need to start with in terms of implementing agentic AI. So that's what's going on. And of course, there's a lot more information in the report, and I suggest that you read it. In terms of that's what's going on with sort of the organizational readiness. In terms of the data foundations, as I was saying, organizations have, of course, made a lot of progress with that, and you'll see the charts in the report. But here you can see that we're saying the strengths are in the areas of metadata, lineage, and access controls. And so we saw about close to 50% of respondents reporting either comprehensive, up-to-date metadata, or saying that metadata is captured and governed. Some saying metadata is available for key data assets and use cases. So people are definitely starting to think about metadata a lot more. Similarly, 50% report broadly implemented or fully automated fine-grained access controls. And obviously, these are all important building blocks for agentic AI. But again, confidence in the data is uneven. So for structured data, about 50% report that their structured data is trusted, and it's sort of the enterprise authoritative data. The rest cite integrity issues, fragmentation, limited coverage. So the picture is the same or slightly more mixed actually for unstructured data. So this suggests that many organizations are still struggling to manage and govern the diverse data types that are required for agentic AI. And another critical gap is a lack of a fully adopted semantic layer. So only about 27% are reporting a governed enterprise-wide semantic layer that's machine consumable. The rest are operating on partial domain-specific or inconsistent definitions. So I was mentioning the semantic layer before, and this could be a limitation for agentic AI. Now, in terms of technology and engineering readiness, remember that was one of the higher scoring dimensions with a median score of 15 out of 20. And that reflects that there is investment in infrastructure and tooling and experimentation. And organizations have made meaningful progress in standing up their technology stack for agentic AI. This started, a while back with traditional AI. And you could see here that a majority report that, well, not here, but a majority do report that cloud and compute infrastructure is provisioned and architected to support continuous execution of agentic AI workloads. And there's also evidence of growing architectural maturity. So you could see here that approximately 35% of the respondents have an architectural approach defined and standardized, and that 40% claim to have an initial architecture approach defined or under evaluation. And that indicates a shift, I think, towards more deliberate system design. More than half have evaluated or selected agentic frameworks. But on the constraint side, you could see at the bottom here, integration is remaining a significant challenge in terms of deep and engineering talent that is missing as well. So there's still some gaps there. And AI governance continues to be a work in progress. So the good news is that many organizations have begun to define policies and oversight models and accountability structures for AI, including agentic systems. However, what we see is often that these are in progress rather than fully operationalized. And organizations are making clear progress in defining governance structures. As I was saying, there's policies, they're actively drafting programs or piloting them. 1/3 have actually defined or improved decision boundaries for agents, with additional 40% sort of in progress. So people are thinking about agents and boundaries and guardrails and blast radiuses and all of that. And these results indicate that organizations are increasingly aware of the need for formal governance for AI systems, even if they're not completely there yet. Now, but on the areas for improvement, we see that only about 1/3 are reporting clear ownership and accountability, while the rest are still defining or recognizing the need for it. And only about 1/4 report that autonomy levels are fully defined, and the majority is still developing this. So similarly, oversight models are uneven, with many organizations either applying them only to generative AI or still in the early stages of development. So you can see that, people are saying, yeah, we know we have to do it. We're starting to do it. Likewise with the ability to pull a kill switch and sort of stop agents. So not surprising that agentic AI is still a work in governance for agentic AI is still a work in progress. And then finally, operationalization readiness. Remember, that was the other highest scoring dimension, and that had a median score of 15 out of 20. And a strength here is that organizations believe they can build on what they already have, and build upon that. 60% agree or strongly disagree that their existing AI operating models can be extended to agent-based systems, and more than 3/4 say that their engineering and data teams can be upskilled or extended to support these systems, although remember that they said that the deep engineering expertise doesn't exist yet. And slightly over half of the respondents believe existing expectations around transparency and explainability and oversight can be applied to agents. So, a lot of this suggests that organizations aren't necessarily starting from scratch, and they see agentic AI as an evolution of their current AI capabilities rather than, starting something completely new. And that's a good thing, although obviously, as we said, agentic AI will require additional capabilities. Now, the pattern that we saw in the data was that these capabilities, a lot of them are still being thought through rather than implemented. So this is still the case for roles and responsibilities, performance metrics, oversight processes, human oversight, and incident management. So another important gap is understanding system dependencies and interactions. So only about half of the respondents agreed or strongly agreed that dependencies between AI systems are well understood. And the rest were they disagreed or they were on the fence. So this lack of clarity is a risk for agentic AI where systems interact dynamically. All right, so I threw a lot of information at you. Again, take a chance to read the report. And I guess the question is, are organizations ready? And certainly the move to agentic AI is happening fast. Everyone I talk to says it's all happening so fast. And at TDWI, we see that it's a top investment area in 2026. And the results of the assessment appear to show that organizations are making some progress towards this goal. But as I said, the term agentic AI means different things to different people. To some, it's generative AI and creating what they call an agent off of that. To others, it's actually, a more well-defined multi-agent orchestrated system. And the data for this assessment really presents a mixed view. While most organizations aren't really in the place to deploy and operationalize agentic AI, they are definitely getting ready. So again, read the report to learn more. And with that, let me turn it back over to Andrew to introduce our panelists and hear what they have to say. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you so much, Fern. That was a great presentation there. And now it is time for our panel discussion. So please allow me to introduce our panelists, first of which is Ana Maria Badalescu with Precisely. Ana Maria has over 20 years of experience in the software industry and data management domain. She currently leads AI engineering and architecture at Precisely, delivering enterprise-grade AI and agentic capabilities in partnership with product teams while advancing shared architecture and standards across the product portfolio. We're also joined today by Santiago Geraldo with Snowflake. Santiago is a technology and go-to-market leader with over 15 years of experience successfully bringing enterprise data platform and AI products to global markets. Currently leading product marketing and go-to-market for Snowflake's AI and ML products, Santiago not only loves solving complex problems, both technical and business-oriented, but also helping people in business understand how cutting-edge emerging technologies will shape the future of work and play. And our final speaker today is Derek Osgood with ZoomInfo. Derek is the Senior Director of Product Management at ZoomInfo. He leads the development and commercialization of the agentic orchestration platform at ZoomInfo, helping orchestrate complex go-to-market work across interdependent systems using context-rich AI agents. He focuses on helping organizations overcome the critical challenges of implementing generative and agentic AI, from data readiness and multi-agent orchestration to organizational rollout and production scaling. With that, please welcome all of our panelists, and I will pass it back to you, Fern, for the discussion.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to have this discussion with all of you. Before we start, I see one question already in the Q&A. Where can we find the report? And yes, you can access it. It's on the TDWI website. I'm sure you'll be getting a link in your email following this event. But if you don't, just go under Think and look at Research and Resources, and you'll find it there. Okay, so let's get started with this panel. So my first question is, I threw a lot of data out there, and I wanted to hear from the panel about what about the results surprised you. if anything? And Anna Maria, I'll start with you. Was there anything in the results that surprised you?
Yeah, so there's three things that stood out to me the most. The first one is the gap between the perceived readiness and operational readiness. So when you read the overall readiness score in the report, it shows 69 out of 100, which initially sounds good and relatively mature. But when you look deeper, you look at the lower scoring areas that are actually the foundational capabilities required for scaling agentic AI. We're looking at data consistency and governance and the semantic alignment, operational discipline. So, like you said, organizations are making progress, but still have disconnected pieces and capabilities rather than a truly integrated enterprise-ready foundation. Second thing that came a bit of a surprise was the imbalance between the technology readiness and the data context readiness. So we're seeing that the organizations are making strong progress on the technology side. There's the platforms, the infrastructure, the frameworks, also progress on the operations with the scaling and the human AI collaboration models. But the report also shows that the biggest challenge is still centered around data and the context readiness, semantic consistency, trusted data sources, metadata and lineage governance, the ability to provide the right context in the right place to this autonomous system. So I think that's an important realization for industries. Building agents is becoming easier technically. It's still complex, but relatively easier, whereas building the trusted, contextualized, and governed data environment that allows those agents to operate reliably, that is still the harder challenge. And this leads me into the third thing that stood out, which is not necessarily a surprise, but a confirmation of what we see at Precisely. It's the central role that the data foundation plays once organizations move from experimentation into autonomous operations. So when AI systems start orchestrating workflows and making decisions autonomously, the underlying data has to be agentic ready. That's what we call it in Precisely. So you have to have trusted and high quality data, governed, contextualized, explainable, observed, semantically consistent. Because in these agentic environments, small inconsistencies don't remain isolated. They can propagate across the chain of decisions and they become amplified over time. The output of one becomes the input to the next and so on. So I think that this is what many organizations are now focusing, like you said, not just building a smarter AI, but building the data environments that are reliable enough to support those autonomous systems at scale and in a safe manner. And it aligns with what we said Precisely. We're focusing on helping customers achieve agentic-ready data, trusted, governed, and contextualized to support all the systems with the confidence that they need.
Yeah, I think that that's well said, because it seems like a lot of organizations, they're experimenting and they're not in a scaled out environment. But once, they're in a scaled out environment and, the volume of data that could be coming at these agents, you have to make sure that it's contextualized, trusted, et cetera, et cetera. So I agree with everything that you said there. I was surprised too. And that's what led me to think that people are, thinking more about that they do know what they're doing than actually, putting this into production and measuring it and, really governing it and understanding what's happening. So thank you for those perspectives. Santiago, what about the results surprised you, if anything?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of surprising insights in the report overall, so definitely recommend everybody give it a read. But a couple things that stuck out to me. I think at the onset of the presentation, Fern, you had talked about how there's a perception gap between how mature companies think they are versus where they actually are today. And I think that that's a really important thing to take into account, because, and echoing what Anna Maria was saying, the sophistication of AI tooling and how the work gets done, especially with things like now personal agents and natural language systems, those tools have become incredibly powerful for how people actually do the work. And it has a lot of potential for making it appear like you can do a lot more than you actually can. And it all comes back down to, again, a lot of the stuff that Anna Maria said. It's about the semantics. It's about the ontologies across your data sets and how those organizational models actually operate. It's about having clear, governed, and and AI-ready data, which is how we talk about it at Snowflake. And I think that one of the big things that organizations need to understand is that the old trope that we've been saying for 20 years, garbage in, garbage out, still applies no matter how modern and sophisticated our AI systems get. And at Snowflake, a lot of the customers that we talk to, we see the challenges appear when they feel very empowered and impressed to use all these AI tools. Some of the ones that we've created, like Cortex Code and Snowflake Intelligence. But it's important to understand that that background infrastructure is what really powers the positive results in this. One thing I'll kind of identify that I think echoes this is at Snowflake, we use Snowflake all the time. So we have an agent called Raven that basically empowers our entire field to ask questions of all of our competitive data, all of our customer data, all of our documentation and everything in between, everything that gets produced by product marketing, by product, by competitive. And it's an incredibly powerful tool. But that ease of use comes with the background effort that all of that data had to be curated. All that data had to be prepared. All that data had to have semantics built. We had to build ontology layers on top of that to make sure that we can build those relationships very clearly and accurately, and then deliver verified answers across the board. Now, where the perception gaps, I think, comes in is when you have those end users that experience the magic, but they don't understand the background of how these things actually get done. And that can lead to a gap between having too much confidence in these systems versus having rational and answers that are actually going to support the work that they're doing in an effective way.
Yeah, I really like that example that you gave. I mean, and obviously Snowflake would be the right place to actually have a solid data foundation. So yep. that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, talking about too much confidence, I think that's a good way to put it. And certainly in the case of your internal example, well, people can have confidence, but they do a little bit and think that everything, to Anna Maria's point, is going to be straightforward. And there are agents that that you all have, that that all of you have, that can work against data and do things. So certainly, I guess you could take a little leap there if you're using some of the vendor supplied agents, but you still have to have the right data foundation underneath regardless. So Derek, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I mean, very much to echo what Anna Maria and Santiago were saying. The biggest thing that surprised me is the confidence level in how architecturally ready all these organizations are. In my experience, I mean, building out agentic systems, as Santiago said, it's very easy to go from concept to demoable thing that feels like it's actually doing what you want it to be doing. And I think there's a lot of organizations where, they're thinking about the architectural problems at the absolute highest level, where they're looking at, like, what models are we using and what orchestration framework are we using to, actually run the agents at a technical level? Are we using LangGraph? Are we using Swarm, et cetera? What's the kind of tool paradigm that we're using? Are we plugging into MCP? But none of that is really the architecture that actually matters when you start putting agents into autonomous deployment. You do obviously need to make those choices, but the nuance and like specific implementation choices that you make in terms of the way that agents are shaping messages to each other when you start having actual agent-to-agent communication happen is drastically more important, because as Anna Maria said, all of these small issues in both your data model and also in the shape of the agent orchestration end up compounding all the way downstream. And so I think it's like incredibly hard for an organization to effectively make architectural decisions until they've actually inverted the process and gone down the path of deep implementation of true autonomous systems. And a lot of that, kind of boils down to having actually gone in the weeds and implemented these things, in a real life use case, which many of these organizations are still not quite there yet. And I think the other big delta is largely many organizations that we see, they are thinking about agentic AI through the context of conversational agentic AI. And that is only one expression of agents. And for the majority of the workflows that they're actually trying to orchestrate, they're really talking about multi-agent systems that are going to end up being a lot more workflow based or truly kind of agent-to-agent communication. And again, that is where you run into significant context engineering challenges. And largely those context engineering challenges don't get surfaced until you really get in the weeds of implementation. So I kind of would echo what everybody else was saying, that I think when you start thinking about orchestration architecture, it's very easy to feel like you have a good handle on this. And many organizations that we run into, have not even surfaced like what they don't know yet.
I think, those are really important points. And the point you made about most companies thinking about conversational agents, I think that we see that a lot in our data. And they think also that they're sort of building a generative AI conversational agent with their data or with whatever else. And in some cases, it could be agentic, but it could just be generative, AI, depending on how you actually implementing it. And your point about specific implementation choices, I think that's really important as well, and that you don't know what you don't know until you actually start doing it. So it's, you don't know what you don't know. So Santiago, then this next question is for you. What do you think are the key capabilities needed to get ready for agentic AI?
Yeah, so I want to approach this question kind of in two dimensions, Fern. I think there's an organizational and cultural aspect to readiness that oftentimes gets missed for the sake of the technology. And then the second piece I'll talk about just a bit more about, and I'll expand on the previous question and what everybody else had said as well. But to start off, I think that one of the biggest challenges for many organizations is actually moving to a model where you actually use AI in a way that actually works for the business itself. Oftentimes what we see are trust issues. We still see black box issues where folks don't really understand how decisions were made. Executives are really focused in on trying to activate AI, but then also hanging very important decisions for the organization on these systems. And oftentimes that leads to confidence issues, trust issues in terms of actually executing, where the wow of the demo loses its luster once there's real life implications for the organization. And that's something that has to be sort of universally changed inside of these organizations that are just now beginning to adopt AI. And there needs to be a universal understanding of how you use these systems, how they can be trusted, and also making sure that that everybody's being transparent on the inputs and outputs. This is where things like observability and traceability, the ability to explain how machine reaches outcomes, those become key things within the organization that are basically essentially necessary to drive that adoption and to get those organizations in the right mindset to implement agentic AI. The other piece I think is on the technology side, and I think that expanding on what we talked about before, the world of context, semantics, and data has come leaps and bounds, in the past even just a couple of years. But I'm thinking back to 5-10 years ago when everything was very manual and ML was this very scary thing. Agentic AI wasn't even something we were talking about largely at that time. We were mostly talking about the ramifications of potential generative AI and other traditional machine learning approaches. But now that world has changed drastically. So, with what we've really invested our time in at Snowflake is trying to make it as simple as possible to sidestep and go beyond those barriers of entry. And what I mean by that is obviously leaning on our very solid data management foundation, and then moving up to what I like to call the semantics and ontology layer that is required in order for you to actually empower these systems. That's something that I think has become a very big challenge for folks, where the common patterns of how you implement agentic AI is, yes, you start with the data. Typically the data nowadays, it looks much better than it used to. So that's a step in the right direction. A lot of people get hung up on the semantics piece simply because it becomes the first step before you can even think about agentic ML. in any capacity. And building semantics manually is one, challenging, and two, you have to have a very firm understanding of what you're trying to achieve and how you're going to build the context into these systems. So what we've really invested in recently is this idea that semantics should be something that enriches the workflows around your agentic ML, your agentic workflows and agentic ML as well. And what we've done is basically inside of our Cortex products begin to automate the semantic generation process. So with for example, some of the things that we're building with Snowflake Intelligence as one, you can now point your instance to the data, and the starting point is actually at the agent level. It'll rationalize the semantics from the database itself. It has all your context from all your databases in Snowflake. If you have things connected through MCP, it'll rationalize those as well and put everything into context. And then more importantly, you can then write natural language to then refine it. So it'll continue to learn from you over time to improve the semantic layering and the ontology layer in a much better way, making it so that a lot of these folks can really just get to work, right? Beyond that, obviously, it's not going to be a full replacement for building and tuning semantic layers, semantic views. But the way that we've thought about it now is that becomes something that instead of being a barrier to entry, it now becomes an accelerator for those agents, where you can actually go and pop the hood open and begin to create your own semantic layering and your own ontologies within that, under the scope that now you have the ability to refine them and make them better and accelerate them, versus having to start from scratch and having to work on it for weeks before you can even begin to work with those agentic workloads. Those are the things I think we see the most there. And then the last thing I'll sort of add is that in terms of agentic readiness, it's about making sure that you also have the right ecosystem around the things that you're doing. So, we talked a little bit about MCP already. I think having a very robust foundation inside of being able to interoperate across the board with any systems and meet the customers where they are today, and bring the AI and bring the agents to their data, not the other way around, is a fundamental requirement now for how the work actually gets done and how people receive value from it.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. I think that the bit about automating, it's interesting because we heard a lot about ontologies many years ago with text analytics, and it just sort of went away, I guess, because it was too costly to actually develop ontologies. So now that you can sort of start to automate some of that, hopefully that will provide a more robust foundation with the semantics and the ontologies. So interesting, very interesting. So Derek, what do you see that organizations are doing well to prepare in terms of agentic AI and not so well? And what should be the one area to improve?
Yeah, I think from my experience, companies are doing a surprisingly good job of preparing their data layer. And I think everybody has been hearing for multiple years at this point how critical it is to get your just pure data infrastructure correct and how to write ontologies like Santiago was talking about. I think where they are still very much under indexing is actually much more at the people layer, to be honest. I think you generally have organizations that are coming at agentic AI knowing that they need to have accessible data. They're thinking about the architecture of how technically they're going to go implement it. But what they haven't done is the harder work of actually defining the processes that they are trying to actually attack and automate with agentic AI. And they have an idea of the objectives and the end outcomes that they want from deploying AI. But they don't really have cleanly defined understanding of how those processes are actually being done today by the people that are doing them, if they're being done by people, or if they're not being done at all, what those processes would look like in practicality. And so, we have in ZoomInfo an agent teams product, which is essentially capable of translating any existing process through just simple natural language into an orchestration layer of multiple agents that are all able to work together to complete complex go-to-market tasks. and leverage all of the context data that's available inside of ZoomInfo's data, as well as the customers. But frequently we will have customers come to us with just a very, very abstract, high-level objective that isn't actually a process. And so we end up spending the majority of the time not necessarily preparing their data architecture with them, or helping to kind of like build out the orchestration layer. It's much more just getting to clarity with them on what the workflow is that agents should be tackling. I think the other thing that related to that frequently organizations are running into is just a training gap in their internal teams on understanding, even going back to the beginning of this conversation, like what the definition of agents are. And people are often misaligned inside a single organization on, are we talking about conversational agents? Are we talking about autonomous agents? What is an agent? Like, what is an agent capable of doing at a basic level? And that ends up translating downstream into frequently, impossible objectives for an agent to solve, or objectives that are just too unclearly defined within the context of the guardrails that agents are actually able to execute around. So I think the one area that I would say organizations really need to focus on improving is the internal understanding of the capabilities and limitations of agents, coming to consistency of definition on those things, and then coming to consistency of definition on the processes that they have internally, independent of how an agent would attack those, just defining like what are the core organizational processes they want to attack first.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I've shared stories of talking to people, and they say, we're going to automate XYZ with our agents, and then they'll say, but then we realized we didn't know the process. And certainly in this assessment, we asked a lot of questions about, do you know the processes? I mentioned that, and that was a low number. Are these processes documented? Sort of a lower number. So I think that what you say makes sense. And as I said before, the conversational agents seem to be the ones that people are thinking about more than the autonomous, which I guess you have to start somewhere, but it goes to the vagueness of sort of the definition. So I appreciate those insights. So Anna Maria, a major finding in this research is that organizations often overestimate their readiness for agentic AI. We've just been talking about this, obviously, throughout the course of this conversation. But where do you see the biggest disconnect between perception and reality? And then what should organizations do about that?
Yeah, so I think we touched on the major themes. I'll just go in a bit more depth, perhaps. So 3 things I wanted to mention. One is perceiving successful experimentation as operational readiness at scale. We talked about this, but it's still very much true. If you look a little bit deeper into that, agentic AI fundamentally changes the requirements, because the systems don't just generate outputs like the early generative AI initiatives. They now take actions, they orchestrate workflows. And so making decisions that makes the stakes being higher for them. In a proof of concept, you have your data curated, you have your humans validating the output, the workflows are simplified, processes, if you know they are simplified as well, scale is limited. But when you go into a production agentic system, now you start operating across fragmented enterprise data. You start operating over legacy systems, inconsistent identifiers, stale or incomplete records, noise and dirty data, and constantly changing operational conditions. The user is not going to do what you expect them to do. They're going to do whatever they're going to do. So everything is changing all the time. And so one important shift, perhaps, and where to start with organizations is that when you talk about the systems, don't think about that all your data needs to be perfect. Start with the data that powers the systems, carve it out, because that data absolutely has to be trusted. What are your critical data elements that you have to focus on, that they absolutely have to meet a high threshold before they go into these systems, right? Because like we said, whatever output comes from one stage, it becomes the ground truth for the next one, that then agent after agent, they propagate and amplify that problem. The second thing I would want to talk about is the importance of the semantic consistency. We talked about ontologies, context, and all that, but with a bit of a flavor of role-targeted semantics. So we talked about that AI systems don't just need data, they need the meaning behind the data and the right business context for the specific user or the workflow that is happening. So when you say customer, when you say location, invoice, or product, it has to mean the same thing consistently across the organization, across all the systems, across all the workflows. Because without it, then you have agents interpreting data differently, workflows becoming consistent, then you erode the trust. And the flavor that comes on top of that is not only business constants has to be carefully aligned across the organizations, but now for different user roles or for different agents, you have to tune it a little bit to bring the right context that is relevant for that particular interaction. So if you talk to if you're thinking of a finance user, when you say product to them, they may think about pricing details and billing structures. But when you say product to a customer-facing agent, they may need a customer-friendly documentation and a technical support information. So the distinction comes even deeper when you build that semantics and the context. It gets even more complex when you move into this production setting. And then finally, the third piece, we talked about it, maybe not as much, we touched a little bit. Governance is perceived as this static compliance exercise in some instances, right? And instead, it should shift to a continuous operational capability. You want to have real-time observability, you want to have policy enforcement, lineage, data provenance, explainability, human oversight, proactive intervention, ideally, because you have observability in place. All these things has to be fluid, operational, and continuous, right? Because the organizations that are moving the fastest are the ones embedding this governance and trust and data integrity directly into that foundational fabric of AI from the very beginning. If you try to put it afterward, it's very, very hard. And it may feel counterintuitive at first because initially these controls may seem like additional overhead, but in practice, they turn out to be an accelerator over time because now you have a solid foundation and that allows you to scale autonomous systems with greater confidence. You lower your operational risk, and then the rework that you have to do afterwards, one day proliferated everywhere. So operating at scale, retrofitting continuous trust, this is exponentially harder once you start your journey and you have a lot of the systems running.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for those in terms of overestimating your readiness. I completely agree that governance should be an enabler as opposed to, something that happens after the fact. And we do see in TDWI research that those who are viewing it that way are getting a bigger impact from their implementations because they put this in place and they can trust their data and actually be able to trace it back, et cetera, et cetera. So, one of the, of course, you said multiple interesting things, but, one of them was about humans and human in the loop, with regard to governance. So Santiago, let's do a flash round with all three of you, because I want to leave some room for audience Q&A, but maybe just if you can take 30 seconds. What role do you see humans ultimately playing in an agentic environment? And sort of don't just say, oversight, because I think that I've been thinking a lot about cognitive engagement and all of that. But, what role do humans actually play in the agentic environment? So Santiago, I'll start with you and then go to Derek and then Anna Maria.
Sure. Mostly oversight. No, I'm kidding. No, so, one of the things that I really loved about, we at GTC, there's this saying that was going around that the organizations that don't use this as a way of cutting the human out are the companies that are going to be the most successful, because the promise of AI, what it's going to be able to deliver is massive amounts of productivity. So if you're working with, and this is all made up, right? You're working with 10 people and now you empower them all with AI to do the work of 50. That means that your business can go literally 5 times faster with almost zero additional investment. And that's, I think, how the role of humans will change, is that we'll be able to do things more quickly. we'll be able to innovate more rapidly. We'll be able to deliver results for the organization, new products, new capabilities, new ways of interacting with customers in ways that, even now we might not even be able to fathom.
Thank you. Okay, I like that view. Derek, what's your view?
Yeah, I think human interaction on this is generally going to be, it's funny because like we were talking about earlier, I think the core bit is humans still need to define the process and workflow that agents are going to end up interacting with. And I think, generally like that is where companies like I was mentioning earlier are under indexing. I actually have the belief that like over the longer run, as companies mature around agentic orchestration, right now they're very, very hung up on the idea of like making sure there is a lot of human in the loop guardrail and observability, and humans are actually driving a lot of the interaction, which is what you see when you're using conversational agents. There's a lot of human back and forth with the agent actually driving the process, and the agent's actually acting as more of an assist to general human workflow. I think that, the big unlocks that come with agentic automation actually come when you remove the human from that equation, and the human's able to actually configure the process up front and then let agents go and drive that autonomously in the background. The challenge with that is, again, going back to the process definition side of things, humans are the ones that need to ultimately define that process and get to a really tight set of requirements that allow the agents to actually effectively attack whatever that workflow is. So I tend to view the human role as a much heavier investment up front in the planning and requirement setting around agents, and then a kind of post QA role in making sure that like they're monitoring that the agents that are orchestrating themselves are actually doing what they're intended to do, and less so that humans are actually the interaction layer driving agentic behavior.
Okay, yeah, I understand that. Yeah, thank you. Anna Maria, what about you? What's your view about humans, the human role?
I have two thoughts. One is reflecting what Derek and Santiago already said. So humans will become more important, not less important. And the future is not humans versus agents. It's the humans orchestrating and governing and supervising and collaborating with increasingly autonomous systems. I think it's the NVIDIA CEO, he said something on the lines that you're not going to lose your job to AI, you're going to lose your job to somebody who uses AI, right? So humans are going to move higher on the value chain, and instead of doing repetitive mundane tasks, now they focus on defining objectives, defining strategy, defining processes, to Derek's point, validating outcomes, managing exceptions, ensuring that alignment with my business goals, my business intent, the ethics, the compliance, and the risks, and all that. And then the second piece, I think that what AI will not be able to do is accountability and responsibility. That remains an inherently human. It's only the humans who can be responsible for something. No one's going to blame an agent for doing something. Ultimately, it's going to come back to the humans, right? So we're talking about building trust. These systems, yes, they're going to build. It's very easy to lose. But ultimately, humans are responsible for setting the systems up for success, and therefore doing all the things that we discussed with the governance and the trust boundaries and semantics and all those things.
Great. I wish we had more time to talk about this, especially the human in the loop. I have other thoughts about it, but I don't know that we have. I want to thank you all so much. It's been a great conversation. And Andrew, do we have any time for audience Q&A?
We're just under a minute remaining left in the webinar today, and both questions, I believe, have already kind of been answered during this fantastic conversation. So I fear that we're going to skip the audience Q&A today, and I will just jump ahead and thank all of our speakers for their participation. So we did, of course, hear from Fern Halper with TDWI, Anna Maria Badalescu with Precisely, Santiago Geraldo with Snowflake, and Derek Osgood with ZoomInfo. Thank you all for your participation today. And I'd like to thank those companies as well, Precisely, Snowflake, and ZoomInfo, for sponsoring today's webinar. And please remember that we did record today's webinar, and we'll be emailing you a link to an archived version of the presentation. And if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, you can locate the resource window to download the PDF. And finally, not only does TDWI offer leading-edge team training to advance team skills in BI, AI, data governance, strategy, and more, but TDWI now offers team enablement to build in-house capability across your full digital journey. More details will follow in your post-webinar communications. And from all of us here, let me say thank you so much for attending. This does conclude today's event.